Ever feel like those rules for when the Army can help out here at home are kind of fuzzy?
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive into defense support of civil authorities, or
Right.
DSCA.
Yeah.
Think of this as your cheat sheet,
Mm-hmm.
not just for regulations, but for what really happens when those green boots, hit the ground in a crisis.
Yeah. And it's not just about natural disasters, which is what most people picture.
Right, because we usually hear about DSCA after a hurricane.
Exactly. But imagine the Super Bowl or even a massive public health crisis, like a pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Those are all DSCA situations, too.
Okay, so wider range than I thought.
No.
But, at its core, what is DSCA trying to accomplish?
So think of DSCA as a supporting role, not the leading actor.
Okay.
The military brings, brawn and logistics, but ultimately, it's the civilian authorities calling the shots.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Hurricane Katrina?
Yeah.
Initially, there was confusion about who was in charge,
Right.
and it led to delays.
Wow.
Learning from that, DSCA is now all about clear roles to prevent those issues.
So knowing your lane, legally speaking.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's where the legal framework comes in, from the Constitution to specific acts like the Stafford Act.
Okay.
These establish the who's who and the who does what.
Which makes sense. We don't want a free-for-all in the middle of a crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a clear chain of command from the President and Secretary of Defense down to your state's governor.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, meticulously documented costs is crucial.
Really?
Oh, yeah. You never want funding to be the reason help is delayed.
Is there a past mission where that documentation made a big difference later on?
Absolutely. After Hurricane Sandy, the detailed cost records from the military's response were essential in securing billions in federal aid for future disaster relief efforts.
No.
Without that paper trail, those funds might have been diverted elsewhere, leaving communities vulnerable.
Wow, so those forms really matter.
They do.
Now, the source material mentions something called a tiered response.
Mm-hmm.
So a local fire can escalate all the way up to a federal response.
That's-
Is there a recent example where that happened?
The Camp Fire in California.
Okay.
It started as a local emergency, but quickly overwhelmed local resources, triggering a statewide response.
Right.
Eventually, it became so large and complex that FEMA stepped in,
Wow.
coordinating federal aid and deploying resources from across the country.
Okay, so it's like a relay race,
Yeah,
with each level passing the baton if things get too intense.
exactly.
Okay.
It ensures that the closest and most knowledgeable people are handling the situation at every stage.
That makes sense, but I'm imagining a big disaster. Who are the major players we're talking about?
Get ready for acronym overload.
Okay.
FEMA, DHS, FBI, even the Coast Guard plays a role.
Oh.
They each have specific responsibilities in a DSCA situation.
Like a whole alphabet soup of government agencies are showing up.
And you're not wrong,
Yeah.
but remember, it's not just government agencies.
Sure.
NGOs, private organizations, volunteer groups, they're all vital parts of the DSCA machine.
Right, like the Red Cross showing up with supplies after a hurricane.
Yeah,
They're always there.
exactly. And the military has to be able to coordinate effectively with all these different groups.
Right.
It's about collaboration, not competition.
So we've got this tiered response system, a whole cast of characters ready to help. But how does all this actually play out in real life? Let's get specific.
Let's say there's a major hurricane, like the source material mentioned, Hurricane Sandy.
Okay.
Want to walk through how that unfolded?
Yeah, let's break that down. What were those first few hours like?
As soon as Hurricane Sandy hit, local first responders in the New York City area were immediately activated.
They're the first line of defense, right? Police, fire, EMS, those folks.
Exactly. But a storm of that magnitude, it quickly overwhelms local capacity.
I remember seeing pictures of the flood. It was unbelievable.
Right. The subway system was underwater. Entire neighborhoods were dark. That's when the state government, in this case New York, steps in.
So the governor would declare a state of emergency.
Precisely. That declaration allows them to mobilize the National Guard, allocate state resources, and basically say, we need more help.
And the National Guard brings what to the table at that point?
They could be doing anything from search and rescue in flooded areas to clearing debris to setting up emergency shelters. It all depends on the specific needs on the ground.
Sounds like a chaotic situation.
It can be, absolutely. And in those really time-sensitive cases, there's something called immediate response authority that comes into play.
The source material mentioned that. That sounds like a pretty big deal.
It is, but it's carefully controlled. Imagine a flash flood or even a terrorist attack waiting for a bunch of approvals could cost lives.
So in those situations, a local commander can act without waiting for the White House to sign off.
Exactly. But only under very specific circumstances. There has to be an imminent threat to life or property and zero time to go through the normal channels. And even then, there are still limits on what the military can do.
That makes sense. We talked about posse comitatus earlier, which prevents the military from acting like a domestic police force.
Right, so even during a major emergency, you're not going to see soldiers making arrests or taking over law enforcement duties.
So it's a balancing act, rapid response when needed, but staying firmly within those legal boundaries.
Exactly. And on top of that, the military has to coordinate with all those other groups we mentioned. FEMA, the Coast Guard, NGOs. It's a massive team effort.
I imagine communication is key in those situations. You don't want people tripping over each other in the middle of a disaster zone.
You got it. That's why clear communication and pre-established relationships are crucial. A military commander might be working directly with FEMA officials, the Red Cross, local law enforcement.
Talk about a team-building exercise.
No kidding. And those relationships, that understanding of each other's roles and capabilities, are tested in those moments.
So you've got this complex web of responders, all operating under incredible pressure. How do they make sure it all runs smoothly?
That's where frameworks like the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, come in.
Okay, so NIMS is like the rule book for disaster response.
Exactly. It provides a standardized approach to incident management, from small-scale accidents to large-scale disasters. Common terminology, procedures, organizational structures, it's all there.
So whether you're a local firefighter or a soldier deployed from across the country, you're all speaking the same language, so to speak.
Precisely. And that shared understanding is crucial for effective coordination, especially in the chaotic environment of a disaster.
Now, what about the National Response Framework, or NRF? How does that fit into all of this?
Think of the NRF as the strategic level playbook. It guides the overall response to a major disaster or emergency, outlining roles and responsibilities for different federal agencies.
So if NIMS is the tactical manual, the NRF is the grand strategy.
A great way to put it. It ensures that the federal government's response is coordinated, comprehensive, and aligns with the needs of the situation.
And this framework is activated during those really big events, right? Like a hurricane devastating a whole region or a major earthquake.
Exactly. When local and state resources are overwhelmed, the NRF kicks in to provide that higher level of support and coordination.
So it's like calling in the cavalry, but the cavalry is a well-organized multi-agency force.
Exactly. And it's all about ensuring a swift and effective response to protect lives, property, and ultimately help communities recover.
Now, we talked about the President and Secretary of Defense having specific authorities when it comes to DSCA. What are those, and how do they come into play during something like Hurricane Sandy?
Well, as the storm approached, the president would have been receiving regular briefings from FEMA and other agencies. This helps them make informed decisions about declaring emergencies, mobilizing resources, and potentially deploying the military.
So the President is like the quarterback, calling the plays based on the information coming in from the field.
That's a great analogy. They have the ultimate authority to direct the federal response, including mobilizing federal agencies, and, if necessary, deploying the military to support civilian authorities.
And what about the Secretary of Defense? What's their role in this disaster response huddle?
The Secretary of Defense is responsible for overseeing the military's role in the response. They would work closely with the president to determine the appropriate level of military support required based on the situation on the ground and the requests coming in from the state.
So they're like the offensive coordinator, making sure the military's game plan aligns with the overall strategy?
Exactly. They act as the liaison between the White House and the Pentagon, ensuring a coordinated and effective response effort.
Okay, so we've got the president calling the shots, the Secretary of Defense managing the military's role. But how does a request for military assistance actually work? Who can pick up the phone and say, hey, we need the Army's help?
Typically, a request would start at the local level. A mayor, for example, realizing their resources are overwhelmed.
So it's not like the Pentagon is just randomly airdropping troops into disaster zones.
Definitely not. It's a very structured process.
Yeah.
The request would go from the local authorities to the state government.
So the governor would need to be on board with requesting military assistance.
Absolutely. If they determine the situation is beyond the state's capability, they'd submit a formal request to FEMA.
Okay, so it goes from local to state, then to FEMA. What happens next?
Once FEMA receives the request, They evaluate the situation.
Okay.
They look at the resources needed,
Right.
and if they agree that federal assistance is warranted,
Mm-hmm.
they pass that request up to the president.
And if the president gives the green light,
Right.
that's when the military might get involved.
Exactly.
Right.
Though remember,
Yeah.
in some cases, like those time-sensitive scenarios we discussed earlier,
Right.
the Secretary of Defense might authorize immediate support,
Okay. Yeah.
even before the president gives the final. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But in most cases, it follows that chain of command.
So the system is designed to be responsive, but also accountable.
Absolutely. You want to make sure help gets where it's needed quickly,
Right.
but also ensure decisions are made with the right level of authority and oversight.
Makes sense. Now, we talked about local and state authorities requesting assistance.
Right.
But what about tribal governments? They have a unique status.
You're right. Tribal governments have a direct government-to-government relationship with the federal government.
So they don't necessarily have to go through the state to get help.
Exactly. They can often request assistance directly from FEMA or other federal agencies.
Okay, so it's important to understand those distinctions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when operating in areas with a significant tribal presence.
Right.
Respecting tribal sovereignty is crucial.
Speaking of respecting boundaries,
Yeah.
this whole conversation reminds me of the Posse Comitatus Act.
Right.
It seems like a pretty big deal in defining the military's role.
It is. Think of it as the guardrail that keeps the military from turning into a domestic police force. It's fundamental to how America functions.
Okay, give us the quick version. What does Posse Comitatus actually say?
It basically prohibits using the U.S. military
Mm-hmm.
or its assets for law enforcement
Okay.
on domestic soil without explicit constitutional or congressional authorization.
So no soldiers patrolling the streets or setting up roadblocks to check IDs.
Yeah.
It's about keeping those roles distinct.
Exactly.
So how does that apply in a DSCA situation where you've got the military responding to a disaster?
Even if it's a hurricane response,
Right.
the military's primary role is support.
Okay.
They might assist with logistics, provide security around critical infrastructure,
Right.
or even help with search and rescue,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not there to enforce the law.
So you might see soldiers helping to direct traffic or clear debris,
Right.
but they wouldn't be the ones making arrests or investigating looting.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The goal is to maintain that clear separation of powers
Right.
between civilian law enforcement and the military.
It's about preserving that balance, using the military's capabilities where appropriate,
Right.
but never compromising those fundamental principles of civilian control.
Right. Now, there are some limited exceptions to posse comitatus,
Okay.
but those are very specific and usually involve extreme situations.
Like a national insurrection or a complete breakdown of civilian authority?
Exactly. Those are rare occurrences. And even then, any use of military force would be under strict legal scrutiny
Right.
and subject to congressional oversight.
So it's a powerful reminder that in the U.S., the military is subordinate to civilian authority, a
Exactly.
cornerstone of our democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about martial law.
Okay.
This often comes up in discussions about DSCA,
Right.
and it can be a bit confusing.
Yeah, the term martial law tends to evoke images of tanks in the streets and soldiers enforcing curfews.
Yeah.
Not exactly a warm and fuzzy picture.
Right. And it's important to remember that declaring martial law isn't like flipping a switch.
Okay.
It's a complex legal concept with a very high bar for implementation.
So when would it even be considered?
In theory,
Yeah.
martial law could be declared if civilian authorities are completely overwhelmed
Right.
and unable to maintain order, like during a massive riot or a catastrophic natural disaster.
So it's really a last resort.
Right.
An extreme measure reserved for situations where normal governance has broken down.
Exactly. And even then,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be a free-for-all for the military.
Okay.
They would still be bound by the Constitution, international law, and the rules of engagement.
Right. So it's not a blank check for the military to do whatever they want.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Any actions taken under martial law would be subject to intense scrutiny
Right.
and potential legal challenges.
It's a heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
One that highlights the importance of civilian oversight and accountability, even in the most extreme circumstances.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Now let's shift gears again and talk about the other players in the DSCA world. NGOs and private organizations.
Right. Those groups that always seem to be on the front lines after a disaster. What role do they play in this whole system?
They're often the first boots on the ground, providing immediate aid and comfort to those affected. Think of organizations like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, or even local churches.
They're the ones handing out water bottles, blankets, and a warm meal when people need it most.
Exactly. They also often have a deep understanding of the local community,
Yeah.
which can be invaluable.
So they're not just providing aid, they're providing a familiar face,
Right.
a sense of hope in the midst of chaos.
You got it. And because of their local knowledge,
Yeah.
they can often tailor their assistance in ways that larger government agencies might not be able to.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does the military work with these NGOs and private organizations during a DSCA operation? It seems like collaboration would be key.
It's absolutely essential. Military commanders need to be aware of which organizations are operating in their area,
Right.
what resources they're providing,
Mm-hmm.
and how they can best support their efforts without getting in the way.
So it's about communication, coordination, and mutual respect for each other's roles and expertise.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that everyone brings something valuable to the table,
Right.
and that collaboration is essential for a successful response effort.
Now, we can't talk about DSCA without addressing the elephant in the room. The cost. Disaster response doesn't come cheap.
Right.
Who foots the bill for all of this?
It's a shared responsibility.
Yeah.
Usually divided between the federal government, state governments,
Okay.
and sometimes even local governments.
Okay.
The specific breakdown depends on the situation and the types of resources used.
So if the president declares a major disaster,
Yeah.
that triggers certain federal funding.
Exactly. That declaration activates the Stafford Act,
Right.
which outlines how federal aid will be distributed and what the cost-sharing arrangements will be.
So it's not a case of the federal government just writing a blank check.
Not at all.
Yeah.
There are very specific requirements and procedures that need to be followed.
Right.
The Stafford Act helps ensure those funds are used responsibly and effectively.
And what about when the military gets involved? Who pays for those helicopters, those troops, all that equipment?
Typically, the Department of Defense covers those costs initially,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
depending on the situation, the state or a local government might be required to reimburse the DoD for some or all of those expenses.
So there's a whole financial dance happening behind the scenes of a disaster response.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And it highlights the importance of careful planning, resource management,
Right.
and transparency.
Mhm.
These events are expensive, and we need to make sure those funds are being used wisely.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground here today, from the legal framework of DSCA to the critical roles played by various agencies and organizations.
That's a lot.
But I want to bring it back to something you said earlier. It's about people helping people. Right.
At its core, DSCA is about supporting our fellow citizens in their time of need, using the resources and expertise of the military to make a real difference in people's lives.
It's about being that symbol of hope and reassurance in the midst of chaos and uncertainty.
Exactly. And it's a powerful reminder that even in the face of disaster, we can accomplish incredible things when we work together with a common purpose.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into DSCA. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
And remember, this is just the starting point.
Right.
If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the source material and engage in further discussion. The more we understand about DSCA, the better prepared we'll be to serve our communities and our country.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.